Welcome. My name is Michaelene Frendenburg. I am the president and CEO of Life Perspectives. I'm coming to you today from our headquarters in San Diego, California. I am so pleased that you are participating. And I just thank you so much for your compassion and your passion. For those of you who aren't familiar with Life Perspectives is considered one of the global leaders in reproductive grief care. We're accredited by a number of organizations to offer continuing education for nurses, therapists, social workers. We love working with pregnancy centers and community leaders and training them best practices for reproductive grief care. We also have a couple digital platforms for those who've been directly impacted, who can begin to process their experience from a loss after miscarriage or abortion. So it is an honor to be with you today, to talk about right now, creating a safe place to heal. And before I enter into that content, and I'm excited to be able to answer your questions as we get to that portion, I just really want to acknowledge that this might be a challenging time right now. Perhaps because you have had an abortion in the past or have participated or been impacted in some personal way. And so you may actually find, as we're going through this content, that it's bringing up maybe some uncomfortable or painful feelings. It may be even surprising for you because you felt like, well, these are things that I've processed already. Well, that's really normal. We know that grief and dealing with these types of experiences is a lifelong experience. But I just want to mention that and just encourage you to be gentle with yourself. Also, as I'm talking about creating that safe place, I will be sharing some stories and examples of how we can inadvertently actually intensify shame, guilt, fear. And we may see ourselves in some of those examples. And so I call those my cringeworthy moments. And I've had a lot of them. And I imagine I'm going to have many more as time goes on, where we think back and say, oh my goodness, like I had the best of intentions, but I fear that maybe I made things worse. So if that comes up, again, I think that's pretty normal. It would be really odd not to have those moments, but let's use those as a way to reflect and to gain understanding and to motivate us to think about how we can do things differently. There's no reason to dwell on them, to beat ourselves up over them. Let's focus on understanding and listening and getting ready to practice again as we interact with others. And we can do this again. Let's be gentle and let's move forward with humility. So it's already been shared probably a number of times now in the different presentations. The fear, the shame, the guilt that individuals who participated in an abortion can have. And in the consumer research that Janine was telling us about, there are about 2/3 who identified shame and guilt. And when I even look at that research and examine it, I'm struck by the fact that the number of people who self-disclosed a past abortion is actually impossibly low. I mean, we know statistically that there should have been many more people in that sample group who were able to disclose that, but they didn't. They weren't even able to do that to a stranger because of that shame, because of the guilt, perhaps the fear that they had. I hear that echoed every day in stories that come into abortionchangesyou.com, which are anonymously submitted, but I can also personally relate to that. I had an abortion when I was 18. I was not prepared for the way that I reacted afterwards. And as those feelings intensified for me, and I really knew that I should reach out and talk to someone, when I would get to that point, fear would always hold me back. I would think of a person and I'd be like, you know what? I know they're really vocal in their opposition to abortion. They're going to judge me. Maybe it's going to ruin our relationship. And then I would think of someone else and I'd be like, oh, I know this person's really vocal in their support of abortion. And so maybe they're going to think I'm crazy, or they're going to minimize what I'm going through. And it's going to make our interaction awkward going forward. And so that fear would hold me back. And it held me in that place of silent suffering for much longer than it really needed to. But, you know, even though we're all, and I know you're here because you're motivated by compassion for those who are hurting. I know that you're passionate about healing. And yet sometimes we can inadvertently actually intensify that shame and that guilt. So I think of a conference that I spoke at some years back, and in the process of my presentation, I was sharing about a young woman who had had 4 abortions by the time she was 21. And as I said that, there was an audible gasp of shock and dismay that went through the crowd that was there. And I remember being a little taken aback and wondering about that, but continuing on with the presentation. And then after the presentation had concluded, and then I was answering some questions of people who came up, I noticed a young woman who was kind of hanging out in the back, kind of in the corner of the room. And as everybody left, she was still there. And so I walked back to her, and she began to tell me about the multiple abortions that she had had. And even though there was nobody in the room, she was whispering to me. And you can just see the shame that she had, and that those around her, and it was not their intention, had actually intensified that shame. And she didn't feel safe to share with those who were in the room. But fortunately, she did feel like she could share that with me. It's also in our language choices that we use. So I know that we had heard about encouraging not to use post-abortion syndrome, because that's not something that right now is accepted within the general public, right? And there's other ways that we can talk about the trauma or the difficulty that people have afterwards. Well, I'd also like to suggest that we think more about some language and some words in that area. And I think, again, I can relate this to you through another experience that I had. So I was at another conference. This was with those who work in pregnancy centers. The room was just packed out. It was great. It was vibrant. There was a lot of energy. And as we went into the time for a Q&A, because I had disclosed my past abortion, there were a number of people who in the process of their questions said, well, you know, because you're post-abortive, what do you think about this? Or, you know, in your experience of being post-abortive, and every time that was said, it was so hard to hear it, but I also didn't want to correct that because I so admired the work of what was being accomplished by those who were there. But I think after like the 3rd or 4th time, I had to stop. And I said, you know, please understand this. I don't want this to come across as insulting, but every time you address me as post-abortive, it really hurts. You're associating me and labeling me with the one decision that I regret the most in my life. I am not post-abortive. My name is Michaelene. And as I said that, half of the women in the room began to weep, and then began to share that they felt the same way. And they have felt that way for years, some of them. But because they thought, well, this is the you know, kind of professional language that we use. This is the lingo that we use within this movement. They didn't speak up. And so there was this dawning in the room that we had been hurting each other. And of course, that wasn't our intention. I also noticed that when I share my story of having an abortion, when I hear others share that, I rarely hear someone stop and say, like, I'm so sorry for your loss. And it's sometimes those little things that we miss. So we're there for business and we're there because we want to help others. But sometimes we forget there's a person right there in front of us who just disclosed something so painful. They lost a member of their family, and they were the person who is responsible for that loss, right? So it's really complicated. And if I could also just throw out, so that when we say post-abortive, it's dehumanizing, right? That's a person, that's not their name. And sometimes we can do that as well when we're talking. So I sometimes hear the term pro-abort or abortionist. And I often think, like, that's a person. That's a person. That's a person who has a name. That's a person who's deserving of us recognizing their humanity. And I don't want to label them, and I don't want to dehumanize them. I think you get the point. But so it's thinking about our words, and sometimes the words that we're using amongst ourselves, and not realizing that those words are not only hurting others, but the message is being heard loud and clear that we're not a safe person to be able to share an experience with. Now, I'm talking about individuals who actually will talk about this, who will acknowledge. We know that our culture, by and large, is silent. And so you can imagine when you have participated in something that is this life-changing, and our culture is silent about it, that's very confusing. It makes it seem like I don't have a right to speak about it, that it's no big deal, that it's kind of weird and there's something wrong with me if I'm actually thinking about it or it impacts me. But into that silence, then sometimes you hear personal stories, but those stories are what I refer to as a narrative of extremes. So on one end of the spectrum, you hear stories of, I was empowered by my abortion. I was able to finish college. I was able to start a career. I'm a better person. I'm a stronger person. And then you hear stories on the other end of the spectrum. I would fit into that other end of the spectrum. I was devastated. It ruined my life. It ruined my relationships. I could barely function, right? I was maybe thinking about suicide. So both of those are true. And it's not that people, I'm saying true, meaning that that's their experience. And it's not that we shouldn't talk about it, but what gets lost is in this narrative of extremes, we often don't hear stories of people who are somewhere in between. So maybe the person who feels relief, but at the same time regret. The person who thinks, I think it's still the best decision at the time, but boy, when I see my friend or my sister and their 5-year-old, it reminds me that I should have a 5-year-old, and I feel sad, and that's confusing. And so you can imagine a whole range of scenarios. And so when we only speak on those ends, it's like all those individuals in between don't hear their own story, and they're not hearing an invitation to share what their experience is. Sometimes there's even this debate about how much somebody should feel or shouldn't feel, or how long should they feel it. Again, I know that we're not intending to, but when we do that, it comes across as judgmental, and we're judging the experience, and it just, like, the risk factor goes up that much higher of, like, do I risk sharing my experience with this person? And so really what I'm sharing with you in all of this is that we face many obstacles to creating that safe place. So there are some that we do contribute to in communicating that we aren't a safe place to share an experience of a past abortion, but there's many others that we inherit, right? We have nothing to do with, but it is the hand that we're dealt, and we need to be aware of that, because it means that we need to try that much harder to be able to create safety and to communicate safety to others. Okay, so how do we do that? So I'd like to share three things, three suggestions. One of them, always keeping in mind the number of people who are impacted, right? So if there's about 1 out of 4 women by the time they're 45 who will have an abortion, then that means there's, of course, a partner, a man, who was somehow, right, involved in this. Then there's all the family members and friends. And so really, when we're interacting with individuals, the odds are that they have been personally impacted by an abortion. So I know these statistics, but I remind myself constantly that the people that I'm interacting with, whether it's in a professional setting around healing, whether it's out at the grocery store or a restaurant, whether I'm speaking directly to them or they're overhearing me, that they have likely been impacted by an abortion. So when topics of pregnancy options, pregnancy outcomes, I am really aware of the words that I'm using and the manner in which I am speaking. And I'll talk more about that later. And so, right, how are they hearing it? I'm always thinking, if the person who I'm speaking to or the person who's overhearing me has had this personal experience, how are they understanding the words that I'm using and the way that I'm saying it? And so that's really a discipline. And it's one that takes time. It's one that takes work. We actually have to reflect and we have to think about that. And so that we are then, in time, we are telegraphing to others that we're approachable and that we're a safe person that they could come to and just disclose what could be for them the secret. Maybe nobody else knows about it. So keeping in mind that those around us are most likely impacted by an abortion. The second thing is that my story, so I shared my story with you, but my story isn't your story, right? Your story isn't their story. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that every person is unique. Every person is going to be uniquely impacted. And the way that if they're grieving, their grief is going to be unique. It's going to be different. The timeline, the process, the way that they work through that grief. If they're suffering, their suffering is going to be unique. The way they cope with that suffering is going to be unique. Sometimes what happens, and it's so natural, right? We're trying to understand, we're trying to put ourselves in their place. But I think it's recognizing that our understanding is always going to be incomplete. And so coming and setting aside our preconceived ideas or the way we would like something to be, and really being humble and being able to be present with that person so that they're not feeling that we're putting things on them, that we truly are meeting them right where they're at. And we don't have any specific expectations for them. We simply want to be there with them and for them. So we're keeping in mind the number of people who've been impacted. We're keeping in mind that our story is not their story. And then the third one would be that there is no one right way to be able to communicate that we're safe. Or when we're interacting with someone who's disclosed a past experience, there's no magic words. I'd love to be able to share that with you. Certainly, there are some words that are going to be less likely to create pain. There's some words that are going to be more inviting for individuals. We've already talked about some words that can certainly shut doors, right? There's other things that can open doors. I certainly know when there's any talk about abortion, for me, I'm always trying to be really cognizant to make sure that I am making some statements about acknowledging how how difficult that can be for people and how everyone's experience is so unique, right? Those types of things telegraph again. So if we don't have magic words, so what is this all about? It's a state of mind, which I've already been talking to you about. It's a state of our heart. It's where our heart is at. And it's being authentic. It's being real. It's being humble and transparent and present for others. And I know that sounds like a tall order, and that can be a little bit threatening. For me, I'm a planner, and I like to write things down, and I like to check things out, and I like to have things that are really neat. And so I find it hard when I feel like, oh my gosh, I don't have a specific roadmap. I don't have the perfect words to say, the perfect things to do, but we're not going to, and we need to acknowledge that. But if we're coming from a place of taking our compassion, right, infusing that with kindness and being there present, that is the gift. That is creating that safe place. And that's giving a person permission to process and move through their experience at their own unique pace and rhythm, and the way that they're going to do that. So let me share a few communication tips with you, and then we can go into, hopefully you're going to have some questions that I can answer for you. So some communication tips, right? Not only is it that we don't have a set of magic words, but I think we all know that communication words are actually a small part of communication. Right? So we could change our language and we could use different words. But if those words are being said in an angry tone of voice, or if our body language is one that comes across as aggressive or, really closed in, that those words are going to be understood really differently. And so it's that body language, it's our tone of voice. So keeping those things in mind. I think about a time where I was with some other leaders of nonprofits, and we were having a discussion about some of the challenges, like our dreams that we had, what we wanted to accomplish, and then some of our challenges. And I started to say, if I could just convince people, if I could just get them to see. And one of the other leaders said to me, do you realize that as you're saying this, you're punching your fist, you look intense and aggressive. It almost looks violent. I want to back up from you. And I thought, oh my goodness, I get so passionate and intense sometimes that it comes out in a way that is certainly doesn't feel very safe. And not a place where someone would be able to come in with disclosing something very personal. That would take a lot of risk to do that. And so I've had to be careful about how I use my hands, right? They're open, they're not closed. But also my posture. So am I too close to someone? Am I too far forward? Am I tense? Those things actually then, right, that reduces that sense of safety. And I know we were kind of hearing some of that from Greg as well, right? So for me, it's like being able to take a step back, for me to be able to relax, even if I don't feel very relaxed at the moment, but so that person can relax with me. Also, when you're looking at someone like eye to eye, right, close, that can be really difficult to be able to, especially with shame, right? Sometimes we want to lower our eyes. It's hard to look at someone. And so I keep that in mind. And so thinking of, rather than being, this way, think of, can we position ourselves so that we're a little bit at an angle, so that someone feels that they have space and that they don't have to stare at us in the eye, even if we're looking at them and where they're present for them. So thinking about that, again, thinking of our gestures that we're using, our facial expressions. So sometimes when I'm unsure about what to do, or maybe I'm shocked by something that's being shared. So like when I had shared the story earlier about someone who had had multiple abortions by the time they were 21, sometimes for me, as I'm absorbing that information, it's like I feel like my eyebrows shoot up to the top of my forehead. And so over time, I really try to control that, because for me, I'm reacting, but it may be understood by that person that it's a judgment, that they shouldn't be sharing this with me, that there's something wrong with them. And so I try again to think of, okay, I'm gonna relax, my face. I'm gonna watch my posture, my hand movements, that listening, right? That deep, deep listening and being present. Silence is difficult, I think. We want to fill that silence. We get uncomfortable. Or if someone is struggling, sometimes we want to jump in and help them. But listening is our gift. And to listen and to fully be present. So I'm not thinking about the next thing that I'm going to say, but that I am truly listening. I am listening so that that person feels heard. They feel felt, that they know that I am there with them. But then also being authentic. So the way that I'm hopefully telegraph safety to others and be communicating in a non-threatening, non-judgmental manner is going to be unique to me. It's going to be different for you. So we need to be true to ourselves, and we need to be authentic and just find what that is, because people know, right? They know if we're being fake. They know if this is just a persona that we're putting on, or whether we are truly there and we are truly with them. So I think as well, if I could encourage you, that accepting that we're not always going to do it right. We just aren't. It's impossible. And it's okay. If we're coming with kindness and compassion, and in that as lifelong learners, that we're always trying to improve and just to be there in the moment, that is the gift. That is a wonderful thing to give someone, and to not be afraid. And it's okay to be awkward. We will be as we encounter situations. Also accepting the fact that we cannot force someone to disclose something that they don't want to disclose. We also can't force healing. That is a decision that only that person can make. And it's really not for us to judge whether or not they need to be healed. That's not for us to do. Sometimes I will hear the like, well, certainly they're suffering. They're just in denial. Perhaps they are in denial. But as we allow them space, as they're able to enter a place of pain, they will do that. But if we're judging them, that's not going to happen. But for some, accepting that, you know what, they are able to cope well. And that's a tough thing to do. But again, allowing someone, meeting them right where they're at, accepting that people are going to be impacted differently, and not judging them because of their intensity or lack of intensity of their emotions, or the way that they think about this past experience. Right? We're not putting window dressing on something. This is something that has to come from inside of us. People will know if we're authentic and if we're true. So I think my final thing, comment, and please, I always feel uncomfortable when I even say this, but please know that I remind myself of this all the time, is that, when we're thinking of the enormity of the number of people who have been impacted, and the enormity of the pain, the enormity of the task of creating a safe place, inviting people to begin healing if that's the path and the journey that they want to embark upon, that the numbers can get overwhelming. It's almost like this faceless crowd. But I'm always trying to remember the one person. I want to think about that one lady who was in the corner in the back of the room. I want to think about her and picture her. I want to think about the young man who had shared with me that he had never been able to talk about this with anyone before. Of all places, I met him when I went in for a piercing. And he said, but I'm able to talk to you. And I asked him about that. And he talked about his level of fear, that he just couldn't talk to people. But as I encouraged him, you're not alone. Things can be different for you. He said, but should they be? Like, isn't it appropriate for me to suffer? Right? But I think about him, and then I want to make sure that when these individuals share their stories with me, share their pain with me, that their pain, I'm not using their pain to prove a point. I am there for them, and I want to respect them and give them the dignity and the space. And that I'm not, I think you get what I mean. I'm not using so I might have an opinion about this, but I'm not using their individual pain to prove that to somebody. And I'm not going to use somebody's healing as a means to an end, right? And I know that's complicated, but I'm talking about being present with that person, right? There's times for planning and strategy and all of that. But when we're there present and communicating safety and we're communicating that we're with that person, we don't want them to feel that they are part of my agenda and that I'm going to be using them to prove a point or as a means to an end. I hope that made sense to you. And it looks like there's some people who've made some comments and some questions. And so I encourage you, we have a few minutes to be able to enter into that. So let me get started. So I'm hearing from Sylvia. She says, I'm an online advocate, and I'm always interested in how to be present with people who don't get to see my body language. Oh, yes. Any ideas on how to convey caring through texting? Oh my goodness. This is really challenging. So, right, we love it that we have additional technology, especially when someone is feeling shame and it's really hard for them. The thought of them talking to a person, much less being in front of them, just seems impossible and overwhelming to do. So the fact that they're reaching out to you through text is so wonderful. So I would just say again, be your authentic self, Sylvia. Considering gentle language that you're using with them and checking in and not making assumptions with them. And I think asking them, we can always ask people how we can support them and how they would like us to be there with them. So I wish I had like kind of some more things, but I think that you get the idea on how to do that. And I think also envisioning, so right, you can't see the person, and we don't want to put our preconceived ideas on the person texting, but still, if we can envision that we're talking to a real person. So what would we do if they were there with us? And I think that we can convey that as it comes across. Okay, Anne, she's asking, is there ever a time to disclose this tragedy to adult children? And what a great question, and one that I'm going to say, well, I guess we can't say all, but I'm going to say probably many people who've experienced a past abortion really think about that. And of course, there's lots of strong opinions on that either way. But I think this goes back again to it's really individual. It's going to really depend upon your circumstances. It's going to depend upon your children and upon their age. And keeping in mind, right, that they're going to understand this differently. And then what's our motivation? So I've heard occasionally sometimes where people, part of disclosing to the children almost becomes a way of like, well, this is how I will process and come to a place of peace. In this case, we need to be thinking about our children. Not about us, not about how we're processing this. It's how will they understand the knowledge that they have other siblings and the way that those siblings were lost. And so that's going to be very different. Sometimes it's going to definitely be appropriate, and sometimes it's not. And so really coming in touch with like, what is your motivation? So I would say really talk that out, seek some wise counsel and discernment around that, and then think about your adult children and their personalities, right? And then also like what your expectations are. So you may be hurt or disappointed, or it may cause you more pain by the way they react. So just thinking of how you prepare yourself for that. Because I am public with my abortion, of course, both of my adult children know, and they couldn't have responded more differently. One who is convinced that this was the sister that he always wanted to have, and we named her, and he refers to her by name. The other one, for him, I don't think he even conceptualized. He knows this would be a sibling, but he doesn't think about it that way. But it certainly motivates him, and he's actually now involved in healing work, right? So I hope that helps you, Anne. So I see another question here. At parishes, sorry, I realize I need to read this more. I'm talking about integrated homilies. Many are sad when they hear the priest's ideal of mercy. So I think just in general, when we talk about this, and I think this is what's so hard, right? So again, we're thinking in any situation, so whether it's a church, whether it's in another situation, that when we're talking about abortion, right, we're mindful that people have made this decision. And so I think, again, always making sure that we talk about compassion, talk about forgiveness, we talk about mercy, that those are things that we're able to express to those who are hearing. Sometimes people walk out when the subject is brought up. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just at the moment they couldn't handle to hear it, but it telegraphs to us that there are people who are hurting. And so how can we also have places on our website, places in our bulletins, places around the church that are leading people to resources and places where they can talk about this? And also understanding, and I am not at all in any way an expert when it comes to the spiritual things, but I have certainly observed in general, and then as we've Life Perspectives worked with those in the faith community, that sometimes there can be an understanding, and boy, I get this one personally, that I thought that my continued feelings of grief, and the intense emotions that I was feeling, that somehow there was something wrong with me, that I was doing it wrong as a Christian. I don't know if that makes sense, but like to me, I envisioned like I should be at this place of peace, and I shouldn't have these continued emotions. And I didn't realize that this is all a normal part of the grieving process. I lost a child, and I participated in that loss. And so I'm always going to miss that child. And where I'm in a place where I don't feel condemnation, the truth is and always will be that that person doesn't exist because of me. And there are times where that's a little rougher than other times. And so I think we have these things of it's everything's going to be fixed. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't at all. And if we can communicate that grieving is a journey, and coping and processing is a lifelong process that we go through, I think that can really help people so that we don't start judging ourselves that we're healing incorrectly. I'm hearing wonderful comments about thanking. So thank you, and I'm glad that this was helpful. I think one last, as we're wrapping up here, is I'm seeing from Sharon where she's talking about cultural considerations. Thank you, Sharon. I think that really goes back to the humility, right? So again, my story isn't someone else's story. And even if I come from a specific background or cultural setting, that also doesn't mean that I can just put that onto, because we look alike or come from the same neighborhood or around the same age, that we're going to have the same experience. So that cultural humility of being present and understanding that there will be differences. Sometimes there's some global things that we can think about. If we have communities that have a high incidence of abortion, that can create some additional obstacles for us. There's just so much pain. And I think also it almost seems like a betrayal of our community if we enter into that pain. And so for us to just be aware of it. For some, there's so much shame that is surrounding premarital sex or having an abortion, that there can just be this gut reaction to lie. So maybe if I even share that I had a loss, I might say that I had a miscarriage instead of having an abortion, because I can't even speak the words because of the shame that is there. And then, of course, we know that people grieve differently and are going to respond differently. And so for some, it's a very, very emotive and emotional experience. I think that's maybe more stereotypical of what we think. For others of us, we're more action oriented. So there might not be as many tears, but we're going to throw ourselves into things. And so keeping that in mind so that we're not, again, judging, and that we're allowing people to process in the unique way for themselves. And so sitting there, always being present, and with that humility that is there and present. There is so much more, of course, that we could talk about, but I hope this gives you that mindset, right? Always keeping in mind the number of people who are impacted, that our story is not their story, that there are no magic words, and that communication, yes, is about words. Don't get hung up on those words either. We can always practice with them. We're going to be able to know how people are responding. And a lot of the ways we learn how to speak is we reflect back the words that people are saying to us. And then what is all of that body language, right? The nonverbals that we are using with people, and then trusting that you are telegraphing to people that you are a safe place, and that if someone discloses to you and you acknowledge their experience and you are present with them and accept them right where they're at, that even if you don't get to see the end of the story or as their journey progresses, that you are making an incredible difference in that person's life. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.